It was an ordinary morning at Oakwood High School. The sun had barely begun to rise, casting a soft golden light over the quiet campus. Inside the school, students were beginning to arrive, excited for the start of another day. The hallways buzzed with the sound of laughter, footsteps, and the occasional shout of a friendly greeting. The classrooms filled up quickly, and the teachers settled into their routines. Among them was Mr. Collins, one of the most respected teachers at the school. Mr. Collins was a man in his mid-40s with a calm demeanor that made him easily approachable. He was well liked by both students and faculty for his thoughtful teaching style and his deep understanding of the challenges young people face. He had taught history at Oakwood for over 10 years, and his passion for the subject was contagious. Students loved how he brought history to life, making them see the connections between past events and the world they lived in today. Today, as always, Mr. Collins was early to class. He stood at the front of his room, arranging his materials on the desk and preparing for the lesson ahead. His students, most of them seniors, would be learning about the civil rights movement, a topic Mr. Collins was particularly passionate about. He believed that understanding history was not just about memorizing dates and facts. It was about learning from the past and applying those lessons to make the world a better place. As he organized his lesson plan, he smiled to himself. The students were eager to hear about the brave men and women who fought for equality, and Mr. Collins knew that the topic would spark deep discussions. He was always amazed by the thoughtful questions and ideas his students had. They were curious, open-minded, and ready to tackle difficult topics. The bell rang, signaling the start of the school day. Students quickly filled into the classroom, chatting excitedly as they took their seats. Mr. Collins greeted each student with a smile, calling them by name and making them feel welcome. The classroom was a place where everyone was encouraged to speak up, share their thoughts, and engage with the material. Mr. Collins had always believed in creating a safe, inclusive space for his students to learn and grow. As the last few students settled in, Mr. Collins turned to the whiteboard and began writing the day's lesson. Today, we'll be discussing the struggles of the civil rights movement and the heroes who made history, he said, his voice warm and inviting. The students leaned forward, eager to start. The room was filled with anticipation, and for a moment, everything seemed perfectly normal. It was just another day in Mr. Collins' class, a day full of learning, exploration, and growth. But little did he know, this day would take an unexpected turn. Outside the classroom, in the school's parking lot, 2 police officers were arriving, their sirens flashing and their presence creating an uneasy tension. There was an air of uncertainty as they made their way toward the school, and no one could have predicted the impact their visit would have on Mr. Collins or his students. As Mr. Collins began speaking, unaware of the storm that was brewing just outside, his students listened intently, ready for the lesson that would soon take them on a journey through history. But the peaceful atmosphere was about to change forever. The bell had just rung, and the class was settling into the rhythm of the lesson. Mr. Collins was deep into his explanation of the civil rights movement, drawing connections between past struggles for equality and current issues in society. His students were absorbed, their eyes fixed on him as they listened attentively to his every word. The classroom was a safe space where discussions flowed freely, and there was a sense of mutual respect among everyone. The air was filled with the excitement of learning, the kind of energy that made Mr. Collins feel proud of the work he did each day. However, just outside the classroom, a different kind of energy was starting to build. 2 police officers had pulled up to the school gates, their squad cars' lights flashing brightly. The sound of the sirens echoed down the street, a sharp contrast to the peaceful atmosphere inside the school. The officers stepped out of their vehicle, their presence immediately causing a ripple of unease among the staff and students. Everyone in the vicinity could feel the tension rising, though no one knew exactly what was happening yet. The officers were strangers to most people at the school, but there was an unsettling familiarity about them. Rumors had circulated for years about their reputation for racial bias and their harsh treatment of certain community members. This knowledge didn't help the sense of discomfort that began to spread through the air. Teachers glanced at each other in confusion, wondering what had brought the officers to the school today. Parents began to arrive at the school gate, drawn by the flashing lights, and whispers started to spread. Inside the classroom, the mood was still light, but there was an undercurrent of unease. One student, Olivia, noticed the flashing lights through the window and leaned forward, catching the attention of her classmates. "What do you think the police are here for?" she whispered to her friend across the aisle. Her friend shrugged, her face a mixture of curiosity and concern. Mr. Collins, unaware of the situation outside, continued with his lesson. He could tell that some of his students were distracted, but he assumed it was the usual pre-spring break restlessness that often set in this time of year. He didn't think much of it and carried on, eager to dive into the next part of his lesson. Outside, the officers were making their way toward the school entrance. They walked with purpose, and their serious expressions only added to the growing tension. The principal, Mrs. Thompson, was quickly informed of their arrival and went outside to meet them, trying to understand what had brought them here. Her footsteps echoed in the quiet hallway as she hurried toward the front doors. She was confused, but she knew she had to keep things calm and find out what was going on. By now, some students had started to gather near the windows, trying to see what was happening. The scene outside was becoming more intense. The officers stood by their car, speaking in low tones, but their body language made it clear that something serious was going on. Their conversation was inaudible from where the students stood, but the students could sense that things weren't normal. Something was off, but no one could put their finger on what it was. As the minutes passed, the feeling in the air grew heavier. No one knew it yet, but everything was about to change. What started as a normal day of learning was quickly spiraling into an unexpected and unforgettable moment. The eyes of the students turned back to Mr. Collins, but now there was a flicker of unease in their expressions. The classroom, once filled with the buzz of curiosity and excitement, now felt like it was holding its breath. At that very moment, no one realized that Mr. Collins was about to find himself at the center of an event that would shake the school to its core. And the students, who had admired him for so long, would witness something that none of them would ever forget. The tension in the air was becoming unbearable, and the students in Mr. Collins' class couldn't help but feel uneasy. The noise from the hallway seemed to grow louder, but Mr. Collins was too focused on his lesson to notice. He was in the middle of discussing a pivotal moment from the civil rights movement, his voice calm and steady. The students listened intently, some taking notes, others simply absorbing the information. They had learned to trust his teaching, his insight into history, and his ability to make even the most difficult topics feel accessible. Outside the classroom, however, things were quickly escalating. Mrs. Thompson, the school principal, had just met with the officers, but her confusion and concern only seemed to grow as she spoke with them. She tried to remain calm, but the uncertainty of the situation was starting to affect her. The officers seemed focused, almost determined, but she couldn't figure out exactly why they were there or what they intended to do. Without warning, the doors to Mr. Collins' classroom swung open. Two officers stepped in, their presence suddenly filling the room. A few students turned around, their eyes widening as they took in the unexpected sight. Mr. Collins looked up from his notes, pausing mid-sentence. The students fell silent, unsure of what was happening. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The officers were stern, their faces unreadable. One of them, a taller officer with a hard expression, walked directly toward Mr. Collins. "Mr. Collins, you need to come with us," the officer said, his voice firm but cold. Mr. Collins blinked in surprise. "Come with you? What is this about?" he asked, his voice steady but clearly confused. He stood up from his desk, still unsure if this was some sort of mistake or misunderstanding. The second officer, shorter but equally as serious, took a step forward. "We have orders to arrest you, Mr. Collins. Please don't make this difficult." The room was filled with a sudden, palpable silence. Students looked at each other in shock, their minds racing to understand what was happening. Some thought it was a mistake. Others feared something far worse. No one could believe what they were witnessing. Their beloved teacher, who had taught them for years, was being arrested in front of them. Mr. Collins, still in disbelief, tried to speak up. There must be some mistake. I don't understand. What have I done? His voice was calm, but a hint of concern crept in. But the officers were unmoved. They didn't offer an explanation, only repeating their orders. They moved toward him, their hands reaching for the handcuffs. A few students, unable to stay silent any longer, stood up and tried to intervene. "What are you doing? He hasn't done anything wrong." Olivia, the student who had noticed the police earlier, shouted. Her voice cracked with a mix of fear and anger. But the officers were unmoved. They simply continued with their task, as if the students' cries had no weight. Mr. Collins didn't resist, but his confusion and frustration were clear. He couldn't understand why this was happening. He was a teacher, respected by his students and colleagues, so why was he being treated like this? The officers quickly escorted Mr. Collins out of the classroom, his hands now cuffed behind his back. The students sat frozen in place, their faces pale, their hearts heavy with disbelief. The classroom, once filled with the excitement of learning, now felt eerily quiet. The door closed behind the officers, leaving a room full of stunned faces. For the students, the world outside seemed to disappear for a moment. All they could think about was their teacher, the man who had taught them about courage, justice, and the fight for equality. Now, they were seeing the very injustice he had always spoken against. It was as if the lesson had become a reality in a way none of them could have ever expected. The impact of that moment would stay with them forever, and they would remember it long after they left the classroom. As the door to Mr. Collins' classroom slammed shut behind the officers, an uncomfortable silence descended over the students. The classroom, once filled with the sounds of eager learners, now felt heavy with confusion and disbelief. It was as though time itself had paused, and no one could fully grasp the gravity of what had just happened. Some students were still standing, their eyes glued to the door, while others sat frozen in their seats, their minds racing. Olivia, one of the students who had cried out in protest, stood there, her hands shaking slightly. She couldn't process what she'd just witnessed. How could the officers arrest Mr. Collins like that, without any explanation? She felt a wave of anger and helplessness surge through her. How could they do this to someone who had been nothing but kind, fair, and understanding? The other students began to murmur quietly, unsure of what to do next. They were all looking for answers, trying to make sense of the situation. Whispers spread like wildfire through the classroom. What did he do? Why would they arrest him? Is this real? The questions bounced around, but there were no answers, only the growing sense that something was very wrong. Outside the classroom, the tension was palpable. Word of the arrest spread quickly through the school, reaching the teacher's lounge first. Mrs. Thompson, the principal, was visibly shaken. She had tried to remain calm and composed when she spoke to the officers, but now, standing in her office, she could feel her frustration growing. She had no idea what had just happened, and the situation was becoming more chaotic by the minute. Parents began arriving at the school, drawn by the flashing lights outside and the confusion spreading through the community. A few concerned parents entered the building, looking for answers. When they saw the police cars, their faces darkened with concern. What had happened? Why were the police involved? And why was a respected teacher like Mr. Collins being arrested in front of his students? As the parents gathered, the first murmurs of outrage began to rise. People couldn't understand why Mr. Collins, a teacher who had dedicated his life to educating students, was being treated this way. Some parents, who had known Mr. Collins for years, stepped forward, speaking out against the injustice they felt was being done. "It's just not right," one father said, shaking his head. What reason could they possibly have for doing this to him? Another parent, a mother, stood at the door, staring at the police officers outside. "They don't even have a reason for arresting him. You can't just take someone away like this. The crowd outside began to grow, with more parents arriving, each one concerned, angry, and determined to get to the bottom of what had happened. Some began to call others, urging them to come to the school. The whispers of injustice turned into louder voices as parents and students alike began to demand answers. Meanwhile, the news started to spread through social media. Someone had managed to capture a few moments of the arrest on their phone, and within minutes, the video was being shared among students, parents, and even local news outlets. The footage, though shaky and incomplete, captured the raw emotion of the moment. The disbelief on the students' faces, the cold efficiency of the officers, and the stunned silence that followed the arrest. The hashtag Justice for Collins began trending in the community, with many people voicing their outrage over the way Mr. Collins had been treated. The video, though short, spoke volumes. It was clear that something wasn't right, and the more people saw it, the more questions began to arise. By the time the lunch bell rang, the entire school had been shaken to its core. Students gathered in groups, discussing what had happened, their voices filled with concern and disbelief. It wasn't just about one teacher anymore. It was about something bigger, something that couldn't be ignored. The students knew they had to stand up for what was right, but they weren't sure how. As the day went on, the anger and confusion spread, and the sense of injustice grew. No one knew what had led to Mr. Collins' arrest, but one thing was clear: his students, his colleagues, and his community weren't going to let this go without a fight. What had started as a regular school day was now turning into something much larger. A movement had begun, and it was only just starting to gain momentum. As the day unfolded, the situation began to spiral in a way no one could have anticipated. The arrest of Mr. Collins was quickly becoming the talk of the town, and the growing public outrage seemed to echo through the streets, the school, and even the social media feeds that many students and parents were now glued to. While the school was buzzing with confusion and anger, the police officers who had made the arrest were facing a much different reality. They hadn't anticipated this kind of fallout, and as the weight of their actions began to sink in, they started to feel a sense of regret. Officer Harris, one of the officers involved in the arrest, sat in the squad car, his hands gripping the steering wheel. His eyes were fixed on the dashboard, but his mind was far from the present moment. He had been a cop for years, but today felt different. The events of the morning played over and over in his mind, and a gnawing feeling of doubt started to creep in. It wasn't just the heated reaction from the community. It was the look in Mr. Collins' eyes when he'd been handcuffed. The confusion. The disbelief. Harris couldn't shake it. Why had they arrested him? What had he actually done to deserve it? The officer's partner, Officer Mason, sat silently in the passenger seat, equally quiet. He, too, had been bothered by the events. He had seen people get arrested before, but this was different. Mr. Collins hadn't resisted. He hadn't fought back or even raised his voice. The arrest had been cold and mechanical, as if they were acting on orders without fully understanding what those orders meant. The students had looked on, their faces full of shock and fear, and Mason couldn't help but think about how wrong it had felt to carry out the arrest in front of them. "I didn't think it would blow up like this," Mason said quietly, breaking the silence in the car. He rubbed his forehead, his voice strained. "I thought we were just following the protocol. I didn't think it would affect so many people." Harris nodded, his expression hardening. "Yeah, but what were we really arresting him for? There's something that doesn't sit right with me." He paused and then let out a frustrated sigh. "It just feels wrong, Mason. We acted without knowing the full picture." The two officers sat in the car, the weight of their actions slowly sinking in. They hadn't expected to cause this much of an uproar. What they had thought was just a routine action was now a national conversation, and it was growing by the hour. The more they reflected on it, the more they realized that they had acted hastily, without fully understanding the consequences. Mr. Collins had been one of the few teachers who was genuinely loved and respected by his students. To see him treated that way had struck a chord with everyone. And now the officers were realizing that the situation was far more complicated than they had originally thought. Later that afternoon, both officers were called back to the station to debrief. They were asked to explain the events leading up to the arrest, and as they relayed the story, they felt the tension building in the room. Their superior officers listened closely, their expressions grave. The more the two men talked, the clearer it became that the arrest had been carried out without full consideration of the facts. There was no concrete evidence linking Mr. Collins to the crime they had accused him of. The arrest had been based on hearsay and suspicion, not on any real proof. When the debriefing ended, both officers sat in silence for a moment. It was clear that they were both feeling the weight of what they had done. Officer Harris finally spoke up, his voice quiet but resolute. "We need to make this right," he said. "We have to fix this. We need to apologize and clear Mr. Collins' name." Mason nodded in agreement. "We messed up, and now we have to own it." The officers knew that a simple apology wouldn't be enough. They had made a mistake that could have long-lasting consequences, not just for Mr. Collins, but for the entire community. They would need to take responsibility, not just in words but through actions. It was clear that the damage had been done, but if they could find a way to make amends, perhaps there was still a chance to right the wrong. As the day turned to night, the two officers reflected on their next steps. They knew that an apology was just the beginning. They needed to be part of the solution, not just the cause of the problem. It would take more than words to heal the damage they had caused, but they were determined to try. The path ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was the only path they could take if they hoped to repair the trust that had been broken. As the day unfolded and the news of Mr. Collins' arrest continued to spread, the entire town was in turmoil. The situation was not only affecting the school but also the wider community. Parents, students, and even teachers had all begun to demand answers. Social media had exploded with posts, videos, and hashtags, all calling for justice. People were united in their confusion and anger, not just over the arrest itself, but over the apparent lack of any real explanation for why it had happened. At the same time, Mr. Collins was sitting in a small interrogation room at the local police station, still trying to piece together what had gone wrong. He had been taken there without any clear explanation, and the officers who had arrested him hadn't given him the opportunity to ask questions. He had spent the last few hours feeling a strange mix of anger and confusion, unable to understand why this was happening to him. Back at the school, the principal, Mrs. Thompson, was working tirelessly to find out more information. She knew Mr. Collins better than anyone. He was the heart of the school, the teacher who always went the extra mile for his students. She couldn't imagine what could have led to this. She called a meeting with the local police chief, hoping to understand the reasoning behind the arrest. "I don't understand why this happened," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice filled with frustration. "Mr. Collins is a good man. He's well respected by everyone here. There must be some kind of mistake." The police chief, who had just heard about the incident, sat back in his chair, looking uncomfortable. "We're investigating the situation. It appears there may have been some misunderstanding, but we need to make sure everything is clear before we can make any final judgments." Mrs. Thompson wasn't satisfied with the response. She knew that Mr. Collins wasn't the type of person to get involved in anything criminal. There had to be more to the story. She pressed the police chief further, demanding that they look into the matter thoroughly. As the meeting ended, she felt no closer to the truth, but knew she had to keep pushing to uncover what had really happened. Meanwhile, a group of students, led by Olivia, the student who had first protested the arrest, had begun their own investigation. They had seen the officers take Mr. Collins away, but they had also seen how quickly things had escalated. They didn't believe for a second that their teacher was guilty of anything, and they weren't about to sit idly by. Armed with their phones, they had begun collecting any information they could find. Pictures, videos, and witness statements. They shared their findings with each other, piecing together the story bit by bit. Olivia spent hours going through social media posts, carefully analyzing the footage of the arrest that had been shared online. She knew that a single small detail could be the key to understanding what had happened. As she scrolled through video clips, one piece of footage caught her attention. It was a short clip, shaky but clear enough to show the moment the officers had approached Mr. Collins in the parking lot. In the background, there was a brief conversation between the officers and a third figure, someone who appeared to be an informant. The voice was muffled, but it was enough to make Olivia's heart race. She showed the video to her friends, and together, they listened carefully to the voices in the background. The words were difficult to make out, but it was clear that the officers had been acting on information that wasn't fully verified. It seemed like Mr. Collins had been accused of something he didn't do, based solely on hearsay. Olivia knew they were onto something, and the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place. The next step was clear. Olivia and her friends needed to take their findings to Mrs. Thompson. They knew that the truth was out there, and if they could help uncover it, they might be able to clear Mr. Collins' name. As Olivia made her way to the principal's office, her heart was pounding. She had never felt so determined in her life. The truth was within reach, and she wasn't going to stop until she found it. At the police station, the officers who had arrested Mr. Collins were beginning to realize the consequences of their actions. After reviewing the evidence, they started to understand that their decision had been based on a faulty report. The informant who had initially pointed the finger at Mr. Collins had provided unreliable information, and the officers had rushed into action without checking the facts. As the truth began to unfold, the weight of their mistake was becoming more and more apparent. In the days that followed, the community continued to rally behind Mr. Collins, demanding that the truth be revealed and that justice be served. Olivia and her friends were. The following days were filled with uncertainty, but as more information emerged, it became clear that the community's suspicions had been right. Mr. Collins, the teacher they all loved and respected, had been wrongfully arrested. It became apparent that the arrest had been based on a misunderstanding, fueled by unreliable information and a rushed decision. The police officers involved, though initially steadfast in their actions, began to realize that they had made a grave mistake. The pressure on the local police department was mounting. Public outcry was growing louder, and people from all corners of the town were demanding answers. Parents, students, teachers, and community members had rallied together, calling for justice for Mr. Collins. Social media posts and videos documenting the arrest had spread like wildfire, with many expressing outrage at the way the situation had been handled. The school, once a place of calm and routine, had become a battleground for truth and fairness. In response to the growing backlash, the police department called a press conference. The room was filled with reporters, parents, and concerned citizens, all waiting for an explanation. The police chief, who had been under increasing pressure to address the issue, stepped up to the podium with a serious expression. He cleared his throat, adjusting the microphone before speaking. "I stand before you today to offer my sincerest apologies to Mr. Collins, his family, and the entire community." The police chief began, his voice steady but somber. After a thorough investigation, it has come to light that the arrest was made based on incomplete information. There was no clear evidence linking Mr. Collins to any wrongdoing, and as a result, we deeply regret the actions that were taken. This mistake has caused harm, and we are committed to ensuring that such an incident never happens again. The room was silent as the police chief continued. "We understand that Mr. Collins is not just a teacher. He is a valued member of this community. His dedication to his students and his work has been a shining example of what it means to give back to others. It is our responsibility to serve and protect, and in this case, we failed to do so. I offer my personal apologies to Mr. Collins and his family, as well as to the students who were affected by this event." As the police chief spoke, there was a quiet murmur among the crowd. Some of the tension in the room seemed to dissipate, but there was still a sense of unease. An apology, though important, could not undo the damage that had been done. The community had been shaken, and the trust that had been lost would take time to rebuild. At the same time, Mr. Collins was at the school, surrounded by his students, his colleagues, and the support of the entire community. He had been released from the station after the investigation revealed the truth, but the experience had left him feeling shaken. It wasn't just the arrest itself. It was the humiliation, the disbelief, and the way he had been treated by the very people who were supposed to uphold justice. But as the public apology was made, Mr. Collins felt a sense of relief. The truth was out. The police officers who had arrested him had acknowledged their mistake, and though it didn't take away the pain he had felt, it was an important first step toward healing. He knew that this wasn't over. There were still wounds to mend and trust to rebuild, but hearing the apology gave him hope that things could move forward. In the days that followed, the officers involved in the arrest began to take responsibility for their actions. Officer Harris and Officer Mason, who had started to question their decision as the day wore on, were the first to publicly acknowledge the mistake. They were both featured in a statement where they expressed their regret for their part in the situation. "We acted hastily and failed to consider all the facts," they admitted. "We are sorry for the hurt we caused, and we are committed to learning from this experience to ensure that we serve the community in the way we should." The community, while still angry at the events that had unfolded, began to appreciate the sincerity of the officer's apology. People knew that mistakes happened, but it was how one responded to those mistakes that mattered. The officers had shown genuine remorse, and their willingness to learn from the situation began to rebuild some of the lost trust. For Mr. Collins, the days that followed were filled with support and kindness. His students returned to the classroom with open arms, eager to learn from him once again. The school community came together to celebrate the strength and resilience that had carried them through the ordeal. Mr. Collins had faced an unimaginable situation, but he had come out on the other side with the support of those who believed in him. The apology from the police chief and the officers was an important step toward. In the days following the public apology, the community slowly began to heal. The shock of the events that had transpired still lingered, but there was a growing sense of hope that things would eventually return to normal. Mr. Collins had been through so much in such a short period of time, yet he remained a pillar of strength, not only for his students but for everyone around him. His determination to move forward, despite everything that had happened, became a source of inspiration for those who had watched the ordeal unfold. Mr. Collins returned to his classroom, greeted by his students with warmth and support. The classroom, which had once felt cold and empty after his arrest, was now filled with energy once again. The students who had witnessed the injustice were more determined than ever to make sure such a thing didn't happen again. They were learning, not just from their textbooks, but from real life, about standing up for what was right and speaking out when they saw something wrong. Olivia, the student who had taken it upon herself to gather the evidence and uncover the truth, was recognized by her peers as a leader. She had been the one who, despite her initial shock, had taken action. She had used her voice and the tools available to her to make sure that Mr. Collins was treated fairly. Her courage inspired her classmates to believe that they, too, had the power to make a difference. It wasn't just about one teacher, it was about their community, their values, and the fairness they believed in. As Mr. Collins continued his lessons, he found that his students were more engaged than ever before. They spoke with passion, discussed ideas with depth, and were eager to explore the world around them. They weren't just learning about history. They were learning how to shape their own futures, how to fight for what they believed in, and how to build a world where fairness and justice prevailed. Mr. Collins could see the change in them, and it filled him with hope for the future. Meanwhile, the school administration took a long, hard look at the events that had unfolded. Mrs. Thompson, the principal, worked closely with the police department and local leaders to create a plan to prevent something like this from ever happening again. She knew that the community needed to rebuild trust, and she was committed to doing whatever it took to ensure that the school remained a safe and inclusive environment for everyone. The school began holding workshops on racial bias, justice, and the importance of empathy, hoping to foster understanding among students and staff alike. The police department also took steps to improve their practices. The officers involved in Mr. Collins' arrest, Harris and Mason, underwent additional training to help them better understand how their actions had affected the community. They met with Mr. Collins personally to apologize once again and to express their commitment to change. It wasn't easy for them to admit their mistakes, but they understood that it was the only way forward. The department, too, began to implement new protocols to ensure that future interactions with the public were more thoughtful, fair, and well-informed. In the weeks that followed, the community began to feel a shift. People were talking more openly about justice and fairness. They were willing to confront difficult truths and to hold each other accountable when necessary. While the events of the past few weeks had been painful, they had brought the community together in a way that no one could have predicted. People were more aware of the importance of standing up for others, of not remaining silent when they saw injustice, and of the power they held to create a better world. Mr. Collins, though forever changed by what had happened, was proud of how his students and his community had responded. He knew that this experience had shaped them in profound ways, teaching them lessons they could carry with them for the rest of their lives. He realized that the true power of education wasn't just about books and exams. It was about learning how to be kind, compassionate, and courageous. It was about making the world a better place, one small step at a time. The story of Mr. Collins' wrongful arrest would be remembered for years to come, not just as a tale of injustice, but as a story of how a community came together, how people found the strength to speak out, and how, in the end, right triumphed over wrong. It was a lesson learned the hard way, but it was a lesson that would stay with everyone involved for the rest of their lives. And as the school year continued, Mr. Collins couldn't help but feel hopeful. The future was brighter now, and the lessons learned from that difficult time would continue to guide the community toward a better, fairer tomorrow.